Hey everyone. So are you curious on which Canadian province crossed the US border the least in 2025? It was British Columbia. And I'm honestly damn proud of that. Now that we've closed the books on 2025, 2026 is already getting off to a chaotic start, explosions included. But with last year now behind us, many US city councils are starting to review the tourism numbers, or more accurately, the lack of it. Today I wanted to talk about an article coming out of Whatcom County, Washington, where local officials there are now reviewing their 2025 tourism season and openly discussing what they believe are the reasons Canadians aren't heading south anymore. So we're going to talk about that in today's video. Before we get into that, I want to quickly mention today's backdrop. This is another photo sent in by Lorelei from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I really appreciate you sending so many photos from Saskatchewan, and I'll definitely be using them throughout 2026. So thank you for sending them over, Lorelei. Now before we dive into the report out of Whatcom County, stick around to the end because I have an open question to the community in terms of how I structure this channel and my videos moving forward. Also, before I show the Whatcom County report, there is another video making the rounds about what the United States is now blaming Canada for. Let's take a look.
Now to a new Champlain connection. New research from the University of Vermont is highlighting the health impacts of Canadian wildfire smoke.
In recent summers, our region has been dealing with reduced air quality, hazy skies, and a subtle campfire smell outside. It was all caused by those wildfires in the north. This new study looked at electronic health records through UVM Health and found exposure to the smoke in the summer of 2023 led to worsening asthma symptoms in kids in both Vermont and in northern New York.
Experts say wildfire smoke contains tiny particles and toxic pollutants that can damage the lungs and worsen respiratory symptoms. The study is the first of its kind, examining the relationship between wildfire smoke and asthma in the Northeast. It has now been published in the Journal of Environmental Health.
I don't know how you feel about this report, but to me, it has the exact same tone as when the state senators or Congress members, or whoever they were, started blaming Canada wildfires for ruining their summers. I mean, what are you supposed to do about wildfires? You do your best to put them out. You deal with them as quickly as you can. They're natural disasters. And if they're comfortable blaming Canadian wildfires for their health, then by the same logic, the rest of the world should start blaming the United States for mental health stress they've caused globally. Anyways, I just wanted to share this one with you all. Now, the article I want to talk about comes out of Langley, British Columbia, and is titled, Biggest Drop in Canadian Visits to the United States is from British Columbia. Now, this report is based on a recording from a Bellingham City Council meeting. I'm going to show parts of the meeting later in this video, but first I wanted to point something out. In this report out of Langley, British Columbia, they state that the monthly land crossings from BC into Washington State have dropped somewhere between 35 and 40%. Those numbers don't surprise me, and that's what I have seen. I've seen similar figures from Canadian media outlets and from StatsCan in the past. However, there is a difference when you look at the data being cited on the US side. A graph from Lori Troutman, the director of Western Washington University's Border Security Research Institute, shows a decline of about 25% from Whatcom County. Now, I fully understand there's a lot of different variables here. Both sides of the border might be tracking different timeframes or different numbers, metrics, I don't know. I don't have a definitive answer of why these numbers differ, and it's honestly beyond my expertise. But if I had to choose a data source to rely on when it comes to Canadian border crossings, I'd personally choose StatsCan. I've linked the full article in the description below, and I really encourage you to read it yourself. What I'm going to do now is play some of the clips from the Bellingham City Council meeting. I'm only going to show the relevant parts that directly affect Canadians. The full meeting is about 2.5 hours, and we definitely don't have time for that.
I was invited to speak about the decline in Canadian travel and related economic impacts to our regions. So I'm going to start out by addressing the cross-border trends that we're seeing. Of course, it's of no surprise, I'm sure, to anybody in the room that over the last year, Canadian visits to the U.S. have plummeted. This is due to a variety of factors that I think it's worth just speaking to briefly. Of course, we had U.S. tariffs against Canada. We had comments about Canada becoming a 51st state coming from President Trump, which of course angered Canadians incredibly so. But lately, I've been hearing more and more Canadians talk about their reticence to cross the border out of fear of the border crossing experience itself, and also out of fear of their safety in the United States. So Canadians' perspectives of the United States have changed fundamentally over the last year. And then on top of those situations, we also have the rising cost of goods in the United States. Inflation in the United States has outpaced inflation in Canada. And then we have kind of an ongoing Canadian dollar that's been fairly weak.
So what we're hearing at the Bellingham City Council meeting is a university expert pointing out some of the fairly obvious factors, but also placing a lot of emphasis on the weak Canadian dollar. I think everyone knows how I feel about that. And judging by the comments, a lot of you feel the same way as well. But did any of these city council members or this university expert ever consider that there are still Canadians going to the United States? And if they are going, is the exchange rate really swaying their decision? I don't think so. I bring this up because on this channel, we've been very clear. Yes, we're disappointed at the Canadians going to the United States, but they are still going. And they're going as if nothing changed, continuing their regular visits. And because of that, I really don't think the exchange rate is what's driving their decision. In my opinion, it comes down to choice. For me, it is my choice not to go to Whatcom County, simply because I don't want to. My decision isn't influenced by the exchange rate. And honestly, if things were different, I'd still probably do my cross-border shopping. I'd still probably go to Hawaii, California, and other places, even with the exchange rate being what it is. But I'm not going because it is my choice. And I don't think anyone in the United States, in an expert or official capacity, even really considers that. Considers that it's actually our choice not to go. Instead, it always gets blamed on the exchange rate. Now, I know there's going to be people saying on the channel that I keep repeating myself, and I need to stop talking about the exchange rate. Well, first off, to those haters, screw off. Second, I want to give a real example of someone who used to use the exchange rate as an excuse. And it's this guy here, the Bellingham Chamber of Commerce CEO. He previously pushed the idea that Canadians aren't going to Bellingham because of the exchange rate. And I know that upset a lot of you as well, to the point where I know at least 24 of you emailed him directly to share your thoughts. And some of those emails, from what I understand, were a lot angrier than anything I have said. Now, what has changed is the tone of his most recent message or interview. He did acknowledge that he understands why Canadians are upset. And he also admitted that our relationship with the United States has changed. And even after 3 years, he openly said he doesn't expect things to change overnight, and that they're in for a long road when it comes to repairing the relationship. I honestly don't know whether my channel has had an impact on that. I don't know, maybe I did when I had like 30 people email him. But I did notice a change in his tone. So yes, I'm going to keep calling out every time I hear the exchange rate excuse.
I just want to point out that this situation does not play out evenly across the Canada-US border. So to put our region into perspective before I talk about it in more detail. So this is the percent change in the entries from Canada to the US from January to August of this year compared to last year. And if we look across all land border crossings between Canada and the US, we see a decline of around 22%. Then this highlights the top 3 busiest regions along the border: Detroit, Buffalo, Niagara Falls, and Whatcom County. And you can see Whatcom County has faced the most severe drop in cross-border travel compared to these other regions. Part of this is our geography. Our cross-border travel is heavily dominated by Canadians because we have such a large population north of the border compared to our relatively rural population in Whatcom County. There's also a lot of permanent residents in Lower Mainland Vancouver, people of diverse ethnic backgrounds that may be particularly sensitive to these fears around the border. And also, we are particularly sensitive to the strength of the Canadian dollar, largely because of the nature of travel by Canadians to our region is consumer-oriented and primarily discretionary. And I'll address that in a bit more detail later on.
Again, with the exchange rate bullshit. But yes, safety is one of the many factors when it comes to the United States. But what always gets overlooked in these presentations and analysis is something much simpler. We just don't like being disrespected. That matters to us. So I want to ask the viewers a realistic question. If Trump never happened and Harris won the election, would you still be going to the United States for cross-border shopping and vacations? For me, that answer is yes, even with the exchange rate. Maybe if I get enough responses in the comments, I'll put a video together with the community's feedback, because I think that would be a pretty solid wake-up call for this university expert, to hear the real reasons from Canadians, not assumptions made from a US point of view.
So digging down more in a sort of a fine-grained way in our county level, this is showing the number of specifically Canadian vehicles entering Whatcom County at our 4 land ports of entry. November year to date, we saw a decrease of around 36% in Canadian vehicles entering Whatcom County. And if you look at January of this year, that lighter blue number, you'll see that's actually an increase. So we were 10% higher January of this year compared to last year. And that followed more or less this ongoing recovery in the post-COVID years after the border restrictions were lifted. And then, of course, that completely flipped in February. We saw dips as high as 50% in March that recovered a little bit in the summer. And over the last few months, we seem to have stabilized at around 35 to 40% fewer Canadian vehicles for this time compared to last year. And I would note that we still weren't quite back to our 2019 pre-COVID volume. So we are welcoming many fewer Canadians into our community than we were before COVID.
Now keep in mind, they're monitoring all Canadian license plates going to the US. And I really wish there was a way to separate people crossing for work, commercial reasons, or family-related reasons from those traveling for leisure. I bring this up because an email I received from a Canadian who lives in Canada but crosses the border Monday to Friday for work. That alone counts at least 20 Canadian crossings into the United States per month. But those trips aren't for tourism or leisure. So while we're seeing overall crossings going down, I'm willing to bet that the number of Canadians traveling purely for leisure is even lower.
So what are you looking at here? I'll take a moment to explain it. This is Canadian passenger volumes at the two Blaine border crossings. The number or the blue graph shows Canadian residents crossing the border into our region over the last 24 years or so. And the green dotted line is the value of the Canadian dollar. So the higher that green dotted line, the stronger the Canadian dollar. And if we look back to sort of the pre-9/11 years, there's a pretty clear relationship between the strength of the Canadian dollar and cross-border travel in our region. And that has changed over time. That didn't really hold in the post-9/11 years. We faced some considerable border friction. And then we saw a return to this relationship around 2010, 2014, primarily because the Canadian dollar was so strong. It actually reached par with the US dollar.
Well, if you look back at July 11th, 2011, the Canadian dollar didn't just reach parity. It was actually worth more than the US dollar. Just saying.
But there was also other things happening at this time, such as the introduction of the enhanced driver's license that made it easier for people to cross back and forth. And then really we were in the fairly long term, I'd say almost 10 years of a clear relationship between the strength of the Canadian dollar and cross-border travel until COVID. And of course, the border restrictions between Canada and the United States in place for more than a year and a half disrupted that relationship. And we saw this sort of post-COVID recovery happening up until this year amid a fairly weak Canadian dollar. So I show this not to suggest that the exchange rate is always the driving factor in cross-border travel, but to point out that over time, there's different factors that have different influences on Canadians' visits to Whatcom County and across the border. And the value of the Canadian dollar is an important one in our region, but of course not the only one. And the reason it's important is because of the reasons why Canadians tend to cross the border.
And I'm telling you, Miss University expert, that the exchange rate explanation that the US media and experts keep falling back on is not nearly as big of a factor as you always claim it to be. I can list out more reasons that are actually driving my decision. Number 1, your president. Number 2, the disrespect from your fellow citizens when it comes to supporting your president and his rhetoric. Number 3, the safety issues and the way people are treated at land crossings and pre-clearance. Number 4, US exceptionalism, especially from business owners who try to explain to us why we're avoiding your country. And number 5, US businesses telling us to ignore the politics and just come back and spend our money. And number 6, the simple fact that I no longer want to support the Whatcom County economy. Now, have you noticed that the exchange rate isn't even listed as one of my factors? I know it might be for some, but for me, and I know a lot of other Canadians, it isn't a factor for us. And the bigger factors are the ones that I just listed out. Now, I'm going to cut it here because the city council meeting goes on for over 2 hours. And I don't want this video to turn into a full-length movie. If you want to watch the rest of it, the link is in the description below. What I have shown you today focuses on the Whatcom County area in Washington, which many of us in British Columbia are very familiar with. But I want Canadians across the rest of the country to understand something. These discussions about the lack of tourism in 2025 and the drop in tax revenue are likely going to happen in other border towns that you may have visited in the past. Border towns in Montana, New York, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Minnesota will soon be working through their 2026 budget. Many of them relied heavily on tourism as a source of revenue. Without that revenue, I expect that we'll start seeing more reports over the next few months about budget cuts and program cuts. And if I had to guess, the US media outlet will avoid saying it's because of declining tourism, and instead blame it on the rising costs. So let's keep an eye out for these kind of reports coming out of the US media over the next few months. Now, I wanted to ask everyone a question who's still watching at this point for a bit of feedback on my channel. Normally, I include multiple stories in one video, simply because there's so much going on right now. Sometimes those reports don't relate to each other, and what I've noticed is that people tend to drop off or miss a report entirely. I've even had a few of you email me asking me to review a report, only for me to realize it's already been covered in a previous video, but near the end, after people actually click away. So my question for everyone is this: do you want me to keep the same format and length I'm doing right now? Or would you prefer one topic per video? One topic per video would mean I'd be uploading more often each day, which I'm totally fine with. It would also let me focus on a single topic instead of jumping around in one video. But I know some of you are happy with the length of my videos now because you're either on the treadmill or else you're going for a walk. I'm fine either way, but I want to make sure that everyone actually sees all the reports that I'm covering. So let me know in the comments. Alright, that's all I have for today's video. If you found any value in what I shared today, please help to support the channel by hitting the subscribe button below if you haven't already. Have a great rest of the day, everyone.